Hello, fellow .NET developers. Who here's working with .NET Core today? All right. Anyone working with Azure DevOps? All right, good crowd. So what we're going to do is run through a couple different ways that we can get started building and deploying our .NET Core apps with Azure DevOps. We're going to start out with a couple of automated ways to get that pipeline going, and then we're going to dive in and take a look at what that pipeline looks like. So to get things started, I'm going to go back to one of my favorite places, the command line. And after I get through these demos, I have a short link that will take you to the GitHub repository that has the code and the build steps and everything else. So if you wanted to play around with this, you're more than welcome to. But what we're going to do is we're going to use a little CLI tool that my boss's boss, Donovan Brown, manages. And that's called YoTeam. And we're going to use that to kick off the creation of a CI/CD pipeline that will go out and end up building and deploying our code, which we'll come back to and take a look at after we've looked at a few other things. So I can start with just by type YoTeam. And what it requires me to have is an Azure DevOps organization, which you can stand up for free. Again, links and everything are there. Most of you have mentioned you're already using Azure DevOps, so you're going to have that. I'm in the Windows subsystem for Linux, and it's playing path games on me and trying to pull the stuff from my Windows side here. We'll get that fixed here in a sec. All right. So, nope, not finding it. There we go. Just call it by path. And it's going to come back and it's going to ask me a bunch of questions. And those questions are going to help me get my CI/CD process going. It's going to ask me what GitHub organization I want to use, or what Azure DevOps organization I want to use. It's going to ask me for a path. It's going to ask me what kind of project I want to deploy. And man, this is slow right now. All right, since this is hanging out for a bit, let's get our other process started. So there's another way that we can start this inside the Azure portal. So inside the Azure portal, anybody using Azure? Just Azure itself? It's like an equal number of folks, and it's a slightly different group doing .NET Dev, using Azure DevOps, and using Azure. So I think I found the right audience. So we are going to add a DevOps project. I can just go into the dashboard and search for DevOps project, and it's going to find that item for me. I'm going to go create. And this is going to ask me a few questions in a more graphical fashion. It's going to ask me what language I'm using, which is going to be .NET. We're going to do some ASP.NET Core. And I want to deploy this to a Linux web app. Now I just need to give it a name. We'll call it ZTP, zero to portal, or zero to pipeline, live from the portal. And we will put that in a GitHub or an Azure DevOps organization that I control. And done, and it's going to go off and start setting things up. And it's going to set up a starter project for me. It's also going to set up the CI/CD pipeline and instrument the application. So what it's going to do is it's going to give me, and you can provide your own code. So you can point this at existing repositories that you have, and it'll scaffold out the build and deployment for you. And it's not the stopping place, right? We can always go and add and customize to it, but it gives us a good start. Let's see, did Yo Team start with me? Okay, great. So Yo Team is kicked back off, and it's asking me, hey, what Azure DevOps organization do you want to use? And we're going to use my Murawski demo. I have a PAT token to give it. Oh. And it doesn't like my paste. So let's see my son and my cat. There we go. I like that better. And it's going to ask me what agent queue I want to use in Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps hosts a number of different build agents for us. We're going to go with Ubuntu. We're going to build the .NET Core application. And what's the name? So we'll call this one CTP Live from Yo Team. And it's going to ask where I want to deploy this. And we're going to go into App Service. Now, based on what I logged into Azure DevOps, it's going to find the Azure subscriptions my Live ID or my Microsoft account has access to, so it can set up all the things that it needs to do to deploy into Azure. And it's going to get those on conference Wi-Fi. So while that's going, we can see that our deployment is underway here. And it succeeded. So let's see what was created for us. So right now, it's set up a pipeline. It's working its way through the pipeline. As we can see, it says in progress. It shows our connection to source. It shows our connection to the build process. And I think it doesn't like me standing there. I think there's a little bit of feedback. And eventually, when things are deployed, we'll have a link right into there. It gives you a really nice look right inside the portal, as well as a really quick start. All right, here we go. We're going to pick demo test. We'll let it create a service principal. Yes, we want to install dependencies. And now Yo Team is going to go and create a competing project. And we're going to take a look at them. We can see what we like best. And after we've seen those, I'm going to show you one more way that we can create an easy deployment pipeline inside of Azure DevOps for our .NET Core applications. All right, so this is going. Let's take a look and see what the build is actually doing for us. Now, this is the DevOps project. So it is starting out with a pipeline. I'm just going to edit so we can see what it created for us. Now, this is using the classic designer. Nope, we'll try about right here. It's going to use a classic designer, which is a little easier to kind of see, but not as flexible as the YAML pipelines. Anybody using YAML pipelines? Much fewer, all right. The last thing we're going to look at is YAML pipelines, and I tend to prefer those, but we get a really nice view of what we're doing inside from here. Now, if you wanted to go to YAML pipelines from something like this, right at the top of Agent Job, we've got View YAML. You can build it in Designer and get an export of the YAML that you can go check into your source code repository so you can evolve your build with your code and have it tracked over time. All right, so what is this build doing for us that the DevOps project set up? Well, it's doing our .NET Store, our build, the test. It's going to publish the test results so that we can get a nice view of whatever tests were run. And then it's going to create a zip file containing the result of our build. It's going to stage an ARM template so that in our release process, it can stand up whatever environment we need or validate that the environment is in the state that we expect it to be when it comes time to do the release. Now that is super important when we start talking about kind of a DevOps workflow, right? We should not care whether or not the environment exists or not. I should be able to deploy successfully from my build process. That means if I'm in a DR scenario and I need to repoint to another data center, I can just change the region I'm pointing to. And I should be able to spin up a brand new thing that looks just like the old thing right from my build process without having to change much. All right. So let us see what our Yo team process has done. It has created a new project. I'm going to check it in, and so that the app build can kick off. So I'm just going to change directories into that project. We'll do a git push. And that's going to kick off another build. Let's see that project. It's going to be similar to the one we just looked at, but it's slightly different because the project itself is slightly different. So we have our ZTP Yo Team Live one. Now, we can go into Azure DevOps so we can look in the pipelines. We've got our pipeline running, and let's edit so we can take a look at it. Now again, this is using the classic designer. Now this project is a little different, and it has some Bower step that needs to be run. So it's going to npm install Bower and then run that to help generate some of the resources that the website's going to use. It's also picking a specific version of the SDK. So if you're using a specific version of, if you're specifically targeting a older .NET version or an older version of .NET Core, you can use it. There's a task that you can use to pick the version that you want, and it will ensure that that version is the one being used for the restore and test and publish, rather than whatever's latest on the box. Because the build agents have a lot of variety of tools and runtimes available on them. So you want to make sure that you're using the right version for your build. And similar to what happens in the Azure DevOps project, we're going to stage an ARM template out, again, so that we can create or validate our environment on every delivery of that site. So let's see what's happening here. So we're going to take a look at the pipeline as it's moving along. And when we look at the pipeline, we can get some statistics, we can get some live logs. So if you want to see what's happening, right, you're going to get a whole lot of information, probably more than you want to see, while it's running. After each build, you can download the logs, you can explore them to your heart's content. It's a great way for troubleshooting when things go wrong, which can be often when you're first setting up your build. But then we have our deploy process. And let's see, I think our portal one's probably into deploy now. So let's take a look at the release pipeline. After we see this release pipeline, the release pipeline for the Yo Team one is very similar. And so we're going to then take a look at YAML builds and seeing the build and deploy defined in one document, and how we get started with those. Okay, so let's see what our release is doing. So it successfully deployed, and we can take a look at the steps. It's a very minimal process to actually get this thing deployed. The first step I have to do is create that app service, and I'm doing that by submitting the ARM template that I mentioned. And then we have a deploy Azure App Service task. Now the deploy Azure App Service task can create a bunch of settings if you need to supply settings at build and deploy time. So if you're deploying into a dev environment and you want to supply different connection strings or things like that, that task can help handle all of that for you. All right. Now, how do I do this if I have my existing project sitting out in GitHub and I want to do a YAML build pipeline? Well, we can set that up. I've already set up a project. And the other thing that I set up ahead of time is in project settings are my service connections. And I set up a connection to my Azure account so that when I deploy into Azure, it can use my creds. And then the pipeline doesn't have to have any creds associated to it. Azure DevOps keeps that and manages that for you. All right, so that's the only thing I set up ahead of time. Now, I want to create a pipeline. So I go to pipelines, nothing's there. I'm going to go create, and I can point to GitHub. And if I've not already authenticated to GitHub, it's going to prompt me to authenticate there. And then I can find repositories. So I'm going to pick this project. And it gives me a number of different common tasks based on what it sees in my repository as what it may be. There's also more templates. If you do show more. So there's an ASP.NET Core template. These things start out really simple, right? There's one step. Do a .NET build, right? And then you can customize to your heart's content. And you're not left alone to customize these templates. We've got a task list where you can go through the tasks. It will prompt you to fill some stuff out. And then when you hit add, it will add it into your template for you. So you don't have to know these things offhand or go looking them up in docs all the time. It's a very helpful bit of the editor. There's also a plugin for VS Code that can help you complete and find the different settings that you need for your YAML pipelines. But I've already built a pipeline, so we're going to create one and point to one that's existing in the repository already. And that's going to be one of the options here after I pick my repository. It's going to suggest one, and I'm going to say an existing YAML pipeline. Now it takes a look at the repository and it filters down and will only surface the YAML files that it finds in the repository for me to pick from. And continue. I can set variables before I kick it off. But we're going to hit run. While this thing runs, I'm just going to walk really quickly through this YAML file. I can declare variables that can be overridden inside my YAML file. I can also declare them at different points in the job. So for example, when we get to the deployment time, I want to be able to specify environments for a job step. And so I can set that variable at that point in the job. So when I create a development environment, when I create a QA environment or a production environment, all I have to do is change that variable and I can keep the same steps throughout. Now, one thing I want to show you, when we use a YAML pipeline and we combine the build and deploy steps, we get a little different view inside of Azure DevOps. Now, so we get this stages view, and it shows us our build and our deployment, and we can see each of the phases and the jobs that it's running through as it goes. But when we drill into them, it's the same thing we saw in the other designer. We see the steps, we see the logs, and I now have 3 different variants of builds running in the 20 minutes that we've been talking that are all going to deploy to Azure App Service depending on what way that you want to get started. There's an easy way to go. Now, if you have any questions or want to drill deeper into any of this, I'll be around for a little bit after. I'm also at the debug bar tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday from like 8 till 11 every day. So please feel free to ask questions. I promised you a link for the project. So if you want to fork this demo, AKAMS, let's make that bigger. Nope. Then you can't see it. AKAMS. Zero to pipeline. It's a really simple sample project, but the included YAML file is a great reference and a great way to kind of get started with building from your repository. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.